Who controls the internet? Who decides what data is collected, how algorithms work, or what speech is permitted online? These are not technical questions, they are the defining power struggles of our era, with consequences for every government, every business, and every person on Earth. I'm Emily Jones, and welcome to this session brought to you by the EU Values Network, a research network dedicated to understanding the values that shape European governance and its place in the world. If this conversation sparks your curiosity, I'd warmly encourage you to visit our website to explore more of our work. Today, we bring together three exceptional scholars to unpack one of the most consequential contests of our time and what it means for democracy, sovereignty, and the future of the digital world. First, we're delighted to welcome Professor Anu Bradford to discuss her widely acclaimed book, Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology. It's a book that has made quite an impression, named one of the Financial Times Best Books of 2023, and awarded the 2024 Steinrocken Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. Many of you will already know her from her earlier book, The Brussels Effect, in which she coined that now famous term to describe the EU's remarkable ability to shape global regulation from Brussels. And she's one of the most sought-after voices on EU regulatory power, digital governance, and the global economy. We're also very pleased to be joined by two discussants today, both colleagues from Lund University. Elsa Hedling is an Associate Senior Lecturer in European Studies and Associate Professor in Political Science, whose research explores how digitalisation is reshaping diplomacy, foreign policy, and the information environment, with a particular focus on the EU and the challenge of digital disinformation. And hello and welcome also to Peter Gottschalk, Associate Senior Lecturer in Human Rights, Intellectual Property and Trade Law at Lund, a scholar with a fascinating cross-disciplinary background in international law, political science, and the regulation of emerging technologies. And between all three of them, we're in for a great conversation, linking law, politics, diplomacy, and the future of digital society. So well, welcome to you all and everyone, wherever you may be around the world watching as well. And well, thank you again on behalf of the EU Values Network. I will now hand over to you, Professor Anu Bradford, for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily, for that extremely kind introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. So what I thought I will do is that I just set the stage with the key arguments of the book. And then we can also discuss a little bit what has changed since the book came out, because we're living really in the era where decades happen in years. And that is certainly true when we talk about technology, and especially when we talk about how technology intersects with geopolitics. So the book Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology starts from this assumption that there's really a global conversation on the regulation of technology. But there is no global consensus on how that conversation ought to unfold. What should we be aiming for when we're seeking to govern digital technologies? And in the book, I argue that there are three primary ways to govern technology. There is the American market-driven regulatory model, the Chinese state-driven model, and the European rights-driven model. So let me walk you through the basic assumptions, and especially the values. Since this is the EU Values Network, I think in many ways it is a wonderful fit for what I'm trying to accomplish. The book doesn't just document the laws that are out there, but really trying to explain what is the regulatory philosophy, what is the kind of vision for a digital society that these three technology and regulatory powers hold. So the American market-driven model starts with this assumption that we want to maximize free speech, free market, free internet, incentives to innovate. So the government takes a back seat and the governance of technology is handed over to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-libertarian, very techno-optimist view of the world. And we see this, for instance, if you look at the US is one of the few countries that doesn't have a federal privacy law. The rest of the world, all the significant economies have moved to regulate data privacy. There's also very little regulation of artificial intelligence in the United States that is consistent with this techno-optimist light approach to regulation. China is quite different. In many ways, the goal of the Chinese government is to make China a technological superpower, not a different goal from what the US has. But China is prepared to deploy state resources in pursuit of that goal. So under this state-driven model, we see heavy state direction, state investment to complement arguably still quite thriving private investment as well. But what makes really the Chinese state-driven model different, that China is also using technology as a tool for censorship and surveillance and propaganda in an effort to ensure social stability and political control of the Communist Party. So this is much more of a digital authoritarian model that China is embracing. So what about Europeans? So Europeans are often described as being forced to choose between an American and a Chinese digital world, since the Europeans lack a robust technology sector on their own. But in the book, I argue that the Europeans cannot choose either of these two visions because the Chinese regulatory model for the Europeans is simply too oppressive, but the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have charted their own way forward, which is this, what I call a rights-driven regulatory model. So what is central for the Europeans is really to regulate technology in a way that the government does step in, but the government's intervention is grounded on this idea that we want to protect the fundamental rights of individuals, the users of technology, the citizens affected by technology. And we also want to preserve the democratic structures of the society, which then includes that we need to ground the evolution of technology like artificial intelligence then to the democratic governance structures. The Europeans also embrace this idea that there would need to be more fair digital economy, which means that the Europeans are prepared to redistribute power away from large technology platforms to the smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. So this has really resulted in Europe embracing a heavier hand, if you like, in regulation, and we've seen a tsunami of regulations coming out of Brussels, with the Europeans leading the way in regulating content moderation or competition or antitrust, as it's called here, or data privacy or the regulation of platform workers. And obviously now that is consistent with the rights-driven regulatory model is that the Europeans were the first to enact a binding, comprehensive, horizontal regulation of artificial intelligence. Okay, so these are the three models. I don't claim that in China, state controls everything. In the US, markets would always prevail. Or in Europe, there would be no kind of neoliberal undertones that would be consistent with embracing the markets, or that there would be no elements that would be similar to what is happening in China. In many ways, we can talk about how dynamic these models are and how everybody's now shifting to some extent to focus on state control, playing Beijing's game, with the US government intervening in the economy much more today, the Europeans being very focused on pursuing their technological sovereignty. But I still would claim that there are three distinct ways that remain very much prevalent in the three models, and that is a helpful analytical framework when we are trying to understand the different ways these three powers are proceeding. So let me now talk a little bit about empires. Empires, why do I use the word digital empires? It's a big word, it's a provocative word, and I use it to some extent metaphorically. But I think it also helps us understand what's going on, because none of the three regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each, the US, China, and the EU, are proactively exporting their respective laws and values and approaches to regulations abroad. But in many ways, they are exporting something different. The US is primarily exporting private power, the private ordering of its tech companies, where these US techno-libertarian principles are embedded in the products and services that all of us are using around the world and are affected by the norms that are guiding American technology development. So if you take something like Meta's Facebook, they have over 3 billion users in over 160 countries. This is part of an American digital empire. And right now, the American digital empire is also reaching us when American companies are leading the edge in the development of artificial intelligence. China is exporting generally something different. I call it infrastructure power. China is building data centers, undersea cables, telecommunications networks, the digital backbones of digital societies. This is part of the Chinese digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. And while exporting its digital infrastructures, whether it is surveillance technologies, for instance, safe cities, smart cities, China is also exporting the digital authoritarian values that underlie the Chinese model. And right now, I think the newest export since the book, TikTok has obviously become a bigger. So now China is also entering this turf of the Americans by exporting the private power, though many say, well, China is exporting state power because the TikTok is more connected to the Chinese government, according to the critical voices. But also now China is exporting through open source AI models. It's AI stack that is becoming increasingly popular and building then the AI stack for much of the rest of the world. So what are the Europeans then exporting? The Europeans don't have the same kind of private companies that are the global blueprint. And the Europeans have not been quite as successful as China in competing, whether it's the Ericssons and Nokias competing with Huawei as the global provider of those infrastructures. The Europeans are not as competitive there. But the Europeans have a superpower where they are exporting something that also has a global impact. And they are mainly exporting their digital regulations, talking about how the Europeans have been leading the way in developing these regulations that are increasingly having a global impact. This is part of what I call the Brussels effect, a term that refers to European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. The brief logic for those who are not familiar with the term is the idea that Europe is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in Europe. So as the price for accessing the market of 450 million consumers, these companies need to follow European regulations. That's not surprising. But often these companies decide that it's in their interest to extend the European rule across their global production or their global conduct because they want to avoid the cost of producing different products and tailoring their conduct to each jurisdictions where they are present. So simply by regulating the single market, it's then the market incentives, the business incentives of global companies that often transform the European rule into a global rule. So this is what happened predominantly in the GDPR, where companies like Apple and Google and Meta are using the GDPR as their global privacy policy. And now the big question is whether that era still extends today and whether it happens in the AI Act or whether we're leaving the high watermark of Europe's regulatory power behind. But that has been what has made Europe a regulatory empire. Okay, so if we now think about that, we have three regulatory models. We have these empires that are extending these models across the global marketplace. These models then also come into conflict, and that leads into these battles that I talk about in the book. So one reason these models lead into conflict is that I don't believe the world is neatly being splintered into the Chinese sphere of influence, the American sphere of influence, and the European sphere of influence. Instead, all these digital empires are contributing a different layer to global digital governance. We have many markets around the world where we witness the presence of American tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and European regulations governing that infrastructure and those tech companies. That means the empires are also colliding. So I talk about two types of battles, and I think it'll be helpful for us to distinguish them analytically. We see horizontal battles and vertical battles. Horizontal battles are the battles between the empires themselves. The US-China tech war being the most prominent of those global technology battles today. The bleeding edge of that battle is the race for AI supremacy, which is seen as a race for technological, economic, one day even military, and also ideological supremacy. But there are also intense horizontal battles between the US and the EU, and those battles are only intensifying under this administration in the United States. So the Europeans feel that American tech companies are coming to Europe, they are taking too much and they're giving too little. So the Europeans are extending their regulations to contain the power of these US tech giants. But that has created resentment in the United States, where the administration feels that, look, it's not our companies that are overreaching, it's your regulators that are overreaching. And that is protectionist, that is targeting American companies, and that is unfair. And for a very long time, even if the US would not have always embraced the European regulatory practices, there was a sense that it's Europe's laws. We can't do much about them. And the tech companies tried, but were only so successful in pushing back. But this is also something that I couldn't anticipate at the time the book came out, how much America is changing under this administration and how much more resolute the US becomes in aligning with the tech companies and supporting their push against the European regulations. So now we see the Trump administration fold these regulations into the broader trade war and threatening Europeans with tariffs if they don't back off from regulating the tech companies, and even threatening to withdraw security guarantees. So these regulations have become not only politicized, but geopoliticized. So these horizontal battles are very intense. The other set of battles we see is the vertical battles. They are the governments versus the tech companies as digital empires, when the governments are then looking to assert their regulations. And Europeans have been leading this battle in many ways. Chinese, though, have also, we've seen a massive crackdown of the tech sector when the Chinese government felt that this sector is becoming more important than the Chinese government itself, or threatening the authority of the Chinese state. Americans have been quite reluctant under the market-driven model to engage in this vertical battle. But interestingly, we have seen very few ideas where the two parties in US Congress agree. But they do agree that China is a problem, and they also do agree that big tech is becoming too powerful. So there have been attempts to contain some of these powers. We don't see it much when it comes to content moderation, but we have seen a quite path-breaking antitrust competition cases being brought against these tech giants. So the US is also selectively engaging in this vertical battle. But these vertical and horizontal battles intersect, which also means that any vertical battle takes place in the shadow of that horizontal battle. And for instance, the United States remains hesitant to intervene in this sector too forcefully, and is exercising restraint in those vertical battles because the US needs these tech companies in order to win the horizontal battle against China. So the US feels it cannot afford to then contain too much of the business models of these companies, even if it had some concerns about them. Excellent. So let me now, in my final minutes, maybe move to the last question, whether one of these models is prevailing, and some predictions that I offered at the time the book came out, and how I feel about those predictions today. So when the book came out, it was the sort of still a Biden era where I saw that there was kind of growing backlash against these tech companies and willingness to assert regulatory powers. It seemed like in the democratic West, there started to be a movement towards a variation of a European rights-driven model where there was a global emerging consensus that the tech companies cannot be left to their own devices. Even the United States started to reassess the benefits of its regulatory model and felt the need to start intervening. The EU seemed to be fighting the battle on the right side of history and getting more countries, especially the techno-democracies, to subscribe to some of its principles. The Chinese model also, I predicted and continue to predict, is doing quite well, especially in the non-democratic world. The world is getting increasingly authoritarian, and they look at China and they like what they see. They don't want to replicate the European rights-driven regulatory model. They don't want to have a model that entrenches democratic control of the state. They like the authoritarian aspect. And there are, I think, a couple of reasons why my assessment on China remains very similar today. I would say there are two reasons why the European and Americans struggle to compete against the Chinese model. One is that the Chinese offer a path to digital development in many parts of the world. Chinese technology is pretty good and it's affordable. And that is very important for many parts of the world. That was the true with the hard wired exports of China, the digital networks, the undersea cables, the data centers. But it's also now the case with AI. The Chinese open source models are cheaper. They are very easy to use. They are accessible, unlike the proprietary American models. There's also another reason, and this is, I think, was one of the most sort of uncomfortable paragraphs to write in the book, but I think it needed to be written because it is true. And that was the observation that I made, that Americans and Europeans and the rest of the democratic world have a harder time telling countries not to follow the Chinese model because all they would be getting is control. Because China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have created a thriving tech economy without being free. And I think that's something that the Europeans and Americans also need to understand, that these countries look at China and feel there is no trade-off. They get control and they can get economic growth. So in many ways, I felt and still feel that the counterweight to this digital authoritarian model is a more united approach by the techno-democracies of the world. That it is the Americans, it is the Europeans, it is the South Korea and Japan and Canada and Australia, of course, the UK together with the EU, that are the key, a group of these techno-democracies that will then provide an alternative to the digital authoritarian model, and that they can work together. What probably has changed most since the book came out is the fracturing, the rupture of the transatlantic alliance, how the US does no longer build its foreign policy or technology policy around this notion of democracy the same way. The US and the EU have a harder time to find the common line and advance that against some of the previously seen as common threats and challenges. So I think that will also make it harder for the Europeans to then export their model without the support of the Americans. And as I mentioned, Americans are attacking the European model much more blatantly. But this is probably where I want to end up, is that in many ways, my prediction that the Europeans model is doing well is also now facing not just an attack from the outside, from the Americans, but also internal challenges. It seems to me that Europeans' own confidence in their rights-driven model is waning. There is an attempt now to simplify, or the critics would say deregulate. There's I would say, a big change in tone after the publication of the Draghi report. I agree with much of the report. I think it is an important conversation. There's now focus on Europe's competitiveness, of Europe's technological sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and a very strongly felt concern that if Europeans just regulate technologies, they can never generate technologies. So let me be clear on a couple of things. I am very worried about Europe's technological sovereignty and competitiveness. Those to me need to be central pillars of European strategy. But I don't think digital regulation is where the problem lies. I think there's a different set of reasons that explain why the US has been better at building these technologies that have nothing to do with Europe's commitment to rights. It is more of a story that there is no digital single market in Europe. It's hard for tech companies to scale across 27 different member states and their laws. There's no deep integrated capital market, so tech companies cannot fund their growth in Europe. Again, their constraint is not the GDPR. Their constraint is that after the first few funding rounds, they need to turn to US venture capital or be acquired by the tech giants. Third, there are legal and cultural barriers to risk-taking in Europe, very punitive bankruptcy laws. The entrepreneurs don't have a second chance. It's very hard for them to take risks, to innovate at the frontier of technology. And the fourth reason is that the Europeans haven't been as successful as Americans in attracting global talent. So the innovators have gone to America. So this is my attempt, and I have since the book written this article called The False Choice Between Digital Regulation and Innovation, where I elaborate on these arguments of what is the relationship between innovation and digital regulation, and where I make the case that the American success is not explained just by the idea that there is a market-driven approach to regulation. The absence of privacy law is not America's secret to technological dominance. And I also make the case hopefully persuasively to some, that the Europeans' path to greater competitiveness, the path which I wholeheartedly endorse as a crucial existential to take, the path there does not travel through a massive deregulation, but a sustained investment in these other pillars of a thriving tech ecosystem. So the message to the rest of the world in many ways is that I think there's a lot that Europeans can offer by being on the right side of history in endorsing that technology needs to be regulated. And I think Europe's moment is coming back just now. If you look at the global conversation unfolding about increasing concern about risks of AI, even the Americans are now getting very negative on AI safety, on the massive buildup of data centers, or what these AI chatbots are doing to our children's mental health. So in many ways, if the Europeans stick to their guns and continue to endorse the model that captures the key values of a European society, I think the world is coming around. There was a brief moment when we were all worried about just AI innovation, but I think right now there starts to be again a more balanced conversation that yes, that innovation needs to be founded on this foundation of ethics and values and safety and rights. So maybe there's a lot there to unpack, so I could go on, but I have such terrific discussants. I also want to hear from the audience. So if I can now pass it on to Elsa and Peter. So thank you for the opportunity, Emily.
No, thank you. Thank you, Annie, for such an interesting overview of your research and your book and within the global context that we find ourselves in today with the various models you outlined there as well. Just to say, we'll find and link to the False Choice article you just mentioned and put that in the description when we put this session on YouTube. So anyone that would like to dive deeper can do so. And yes, we will now turn to the first of our expert discussants with us today, Elsa Hedling from Lund University, for her thoughts and reflections and questions on the book. Over to you, Elsa.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the opportunity to actually reread the book, because I read it when it first came out, and it was wonderful to get the chance to reread it now, and also to revisit some of your arguments. And what I was struck by was actually by how many of them actually have held up, despite the fact that, as you said, decades are now happening in years. So much has happened, but a lot of the core ideas are still, I think, very convincing in this book. And I think also I want to thank you for the discussion just now and the way that you actually contextualized the book more in relation to current events. And I thought it was especially interesting to hear about this relationship between the vertical battles and the horizontal battles, and how that plays out in a context of changing geopolitical tensions, and not least between the US and Europe currently. So thank you very much. I wanted to focus my comments, especially on the European model and what you call the rights-driven regulatory model, which also strongly resonates with the network's focus on European values. And I have essentially three areas of comments and questions. First is regards to the foundations of the European model, or the legitimacy of the European model. I also wanted to ask a few things about the relationship to AI, which you touched upon already, but I have some questions. And then finally, recent developments and what they suggest about Europe's future trajectory here. So my questions seem to revolve around legitimacy and also how sort of the long run, what will happen for Europe in the long run here. So in the book, I found it especially interesting when you kind of engage with this idea of the empire. So the idea of also expanding, using these models for the sort of expansionist role in the world. And for Europe, this expansion then takes place through regulation. So it's the capacity to regulate, so to globalize digital rights, but also to do that through market size. So the fact that we have the single market. And I wanted to ask you, because you also engage critically with these ideas of regulatory imperialism that you sometimes hear. And I wanted to ask you, when the EU engages in this regulatory power, do you primarily understand this as some form of norm diffusion? So an internationalization of rights-based principles, or is it a form of power politics or regulatory power politics that is grounded in then economic reach and legal reach? And one of the reasons why I wanted to ask that question is also because I was wondering about what happens when the market power is reduced. So we know we have these projections of what will happen to Europe in the future as we have these emerging powers, emerging markets. So what would sustain the legitimacy of the European model if Europe's regulatory reach begins to outpace this market power that it currently has? So what will happen to this model when perhaps that happens? And then I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, and you talked about it now, this tension between regulation and innovation that you don't necessarily agree with, and this has certainly, I think, intensified with the rise of AI. And I was also wondering if you think how that the need for leadership in AI technology, what that specifically does to the regulatory model. So I was wondering, can a value-driven regulatory model keep pace with the rapid speed of AI development without this corresponding technological leadership? And then finally, and I think maybe Peter will expand on this, I was wondering in relation to the deregulation moves that we're seeing in Europe at the moment, and I'm sure Peter will maybe talk about the digital omnibus package. But I was wondering how we should see that, how we should see these steps towards deregulation, and whether you see that as a form of weakening of the European model, or rather some kind of adaptation or recalibration. So those were my questions, and I'm happy to give the word over to Peter, who can continue perhaps on these points.
Okay. Hello. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anu. It was nice to hear you in person speaking about this book that I've read and several when it came, actually. I have read The Brussels Effect a few times before, and I think among connecting a bit to your question when we talked before, whether how known the book is. I think generally among especially EU lawyers, the Brussels Effect is a more general work, not focused on digitalization. So I think generally people know it much more. I will come back to the Brussels Effect a bit, because I do have there are a few questions that I'm very interested in when it comes more conceptually. I'm not going to review the book, because many people have done that, and I think you're well aware of that. You get very positive reviews generally, but I would like to just comment on a few things. I think that a real strength of the book is sort of a kind of mapping of a kind of geopolitical structure and of the sort of emerging and to some extent quickly moving digital economy. And I think we learn there all the time. And I think that's really one of the strengths of the book. And I think that's why I really appreciated your last minutes when you talked and looking at the current events or what we should call them, I don't know, the developments and the sort of turn to a more geoeconomic considerations where we sort of intertwine security and markets more generally. I do like just a few words about some of the methodology, if I would call it that. I do like and I do like that you addressed that the empire metaphor. That's one point that I like, and I think you could have made more of it because I think when you mention the imperial past and so on, I think there are even to some extent the vertical horizontal distinction or public private or whichever way we should sort of conceptualize it. We can see that the British Empire started with a private East India Company. So there is a historical link there as well with those kinds of practices. I'm not going to say much about the models, but relating to a strength is definitely kind of the clarity and the story that you can tell because it's quite easy to grasp, and I like that. So we can build on that. I know that there has been some. I checked out some of the reviews of the book, and sometimes you do receive some criticism about some of the theorizing and so on. But I still think that to me, it's fine. It's possible to use the book now and deepen theorization later. And I admit that I started reading your chapter on the false false relationship between innovation and regulation. And I noted that um, there's quite a lot of theory there, and I like that. So I see that as a way of going beyond in what you've done in the book. Otherwise, I think it's very a strength is certainly, and I think it's the biggest strength with the book. It's the distinction between the sort of state-to-state rivalry, the horizontal one, and the vertical battles you talk about. I think it's nice in the book when you call it that this book is about a battle for the soul of the digital economy, and I think it's very much about that. Um, uh, um, I I do think, however, because I deal quite a lot with intellectual property, that in the book as such, uh, the innovation issue and competitiveness issue is uh, there. It's intertwined in a way that you do not always see that. So I think it's good that you wrote this new article because it really kicks in and uh, and you get the innovation issues, which are, I think, quite central here. I have just I have a few questions which are more straightforward. Uh, because when you talked about the three models, and already in your book you say that we cannot say that one model will win over the others, and I think if we look at the latest ministerial conference in Cameroon with the WTO and the failed attempts to get some kind of digital regulation, I think we can conclude that there is no good prospect for a kind of global regulation. But therefore, I wonder how you say that you still think they will layer in different ways, but I somehow see that it seems more like they're moving against the Chinese model a bit more. I just wonder about your reflections there. Um, that's the first question. The second one is that when it comes to conceptualization, I like your use of the sort of power talk, private power, the infrastructural power, the regulatory power. Um, and the regulatory power of the EU is, of course, the Brussels model. But how do you think, does that model how does that fit in the new geoeconomy? Because don't you think that in a more coercive environment, you might have to adjust the theory about the Brussels effect? I'm not saying that it will disappear, but certainly you must have thought a bit about that. And then the last one is the argument that we have against or get against regulatory regulating the digital economy in Europe is certainly that we sacrifice innovation. We can see that with the withdrawn standard essential patents regulation, that it will kill innovation in Europe. But I agree with much of what you said. But what kind of regulation should we have? Is it competition law? Because competition is important. And I have the feeling that we know quite a lot about digital markets, about network effects. They create concentration, they create barriers to entry, we get killer acquisitions and so on. But I still don't think that I get the impression that regulators don't always understand that when they design the measures. And I think I read a review by Julie Cohen where she said that actually these kinds of platforms are not always what we traditionally think of as markets, and maybe we need other regulatory means. So I'm wondering about your thoughts about perhaps thinking more sophisticated about regulation and the means that we should use there. So I think I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such thoughtful engagement with the work. I really, really appreciate it. I think the comments are very well taken. They go to the heart of the argument and help improve it. In many ways, when you try to do something that's sweeping, when you write a book that is about US and EU and China and AI and content moderation and antitrust and privacy and geopolitics, it is one of those that you need to approach it with some degree of like maybe comfort with intellectual recklessness or the risk taking, but also with some degree of humility, realizing that the goal is never to say the last word. The goal is really to hope to generate conversations and for others to go deeper where the book falls short. And I think your question already show wonderful pathways for that. So the question on from Elsa on kind of whether this is about power or values that the EU is trying to export. And I think in many ways it's both. I think there is a kind of a European sense that these are the right values and a sense that the world would be a better place if we didn't have as much surveillance in other parts of the world, if privacy was protected, if there was a more kind of fair diffusion of the benefits of digital transformation. So partially, I think there can be the kind of idea of the EU being a benevolent hegemon. This is a kind of little dangerous path to take because the Europeans do have a history when you say, like Peter was recognizing, that there's a sense that we are exporting our civilization because we know what's good for us would be good for the rest of the world. And I think there is a good self-reflection to be had about whether European values necessarily resonate in many parts of the world. And I noticed that in some of my conversations that when, for instance, countries that have very high crime rates, they say, look, we actually like the surveillance technologies and privacy is not our top 50 concerns. We just can't afford. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We are not yet there. We need to first maintain public order. We need to maintain safety. Our population just does not value privacy, doesn't have the luxury to value privacy at the same level. So I think that's a fair question to be had. But in many ways, the core of the Brussels effect is that the Europeans have a sovereign right, even an obligation to regulate their own market. And if global companies then adjust their behavior globally, because it's in their business interest to do that, I think it would be a little bit unfair to attribute that to European regulatory imperialism when Europe is regulating its own marketplace. So I tried to have a more nuanced conversation about that concept. But there's also direct economic effect that the Europeans feel if the European values are shaping the global marketplace, the European companies, when competing against an American company in the Japanese market, is not at a competitive disadvantage if also the American companies are adhering globally to the same standard. So I think there is the kind of the leveling the playing field, which is purely an economic argument as well. Then your question on regulatory sort of regulatory power and then leadership in AI and whether that's inconsistent. In many ways, I think that's where I try to get to with this idea that with the false choice that the Europeans can defend their regulations. But I think regulations as such also are a source of stability and predictability in an increasingly turbulent world today. I think it is a comparative advantage that Europeans have that we can actually have consumers trust AI technology so that there will be a greater uptake of that technology. This is now becoming a barrier in the United States. You see some striking public opinion surveys where 10% of Americans think that the benefits are greater than the harms of AI. So that is going to be a limit to how AI adoption is going to unfold across the society. And partially, I think if we have a stronger sense that the harms are being addressed, the labor market issues will be a part of the kind of social engineering that the state does in thinking about redistribution and labor protections, that we control the risks of too powerful AI models, that we protect the individual's rights, including the mental health of children who engage with these technologies. I think that would help restore the confidence in the technology that our societies desperately need so that we can get the benefits as well. With the deregulation, I think it's always the choice whether you use the word simplification or deregulation. I am not against simplification. I think every thoughtful regulator, when you regulate fast-moving technology, you need to be more nimble. You need to be prepared to revisit. You need to make sure there are not inconsistencies. So I don't think categorically opposing any such effort to realign the regulation is beneficial or helpful. I, at the same time, though, worry that we might be overshooting the mark. And if we are now removing that predictability and now have moved to the terrain that I think the rest of the world sees the EU as hesitating, the European companies, the targets of regulation see the EU as hesitating, that kind of loss of confidence and predictability ultimately, I think, is not helpful. It can also lead to the Europeans trying to go too far with the simplification and lose something that is valuable. And I think that's the big concern. And that can weaken the Brussels effect, especially also the de jure side that the government's looking whether we should be regulating AI, but well, let's just wait to see what the Europeans are going to be doing with their laws as well. So I think there's a little bit of a danger there. And I guess the biggest danger is that now this is taking a lot of political capital. And I think a lot of political capital should be dedicated to build those other pillars of the tech ecosystem. And I really would want to prioritize that in the political process. On the layer, Peter, whether we see that the layers are still there and the Europeans and Americans and Chinese are all contributing something. I briefly mentioned in my remarks, but I think the Chinese model is doing very well, especially now in the AI. The open source models are really helpful with the global adoption of the Chinese AI stack. And also the world is moving more and more authoritarian. I think the democratic controls are weakening, and that then helps the kind of receptiveness of the Chinese towards the Chinese model. I think America's volatility as an international actor is not helpful in restoring confidence that the US has a direction that everybody wants to follow at this point. And I think the soft power that has been so central to American success and to America being seen as an example, that's also the loss of that is an opening for China. So I do see some sort of changes in these geopolitical quite tectonic shifts that we are observing. Also, we do move closer towards decoupling. I don't think we are fully decoupling. I think there are many examples. You're not going to decouple like semiconductor supply chains where one chip can cross an international border 70 times before it is manufactured. So, but with the increasing use of export controls and investment restrictions, we see both greater state involvement, which is again and embracing the Chinese model, but also then kind of a more of a separation of some of the spheres where the US is setting ultimatums that you can't even deal, then telling the Europeans that they can't deal with Chinese and so forth. So I think that makes the layers, I think, less smooth and more contested. I think also then whether the Brussels effect as a theory needs to be maybe rethought in the geopolitical era. In many ways, I think what I never appreciated at the time, and I don't know if anybody did, how much we would see the regulation be entangled in that broader geopolitical game. We never thought that Europe is facing a choice between AI Act and Ukraine. The idea that we suddenly face the idea that the security guarantees from Ukraine are withdrawn unless we rethink the approach to regulation. So this kind of embedding the digital regulations into these geopolitical battles. And I think in many ways, I expected the Brussels effect to be more robust, the regulation, because it's very difficult to, the US can walk away from international organizations, but it's very hard to walk away from companies' sort of market-driven choices to pursue the benefits of standardization. But right now, if the US tech companies are told by the White House to behave in a certain way or not provide technologies to Europe, this is all, they are much more political, the choices that the tech companies are making around regulation and their alliances as well. So I think that obviously requires a little bit more of a retooling. You might ask why the Europeans would ever capitulate to the Americans. The US is 13% of Europe's trade, 87% with the rest of the world. So Europe doesn't desperately need the trade with the US, but Europe needs the technologies and especially military technologies and intelligence and other military support still from the US. So I think the idea that when regulation becomes geopoliticized, I understand the logic why the Europeans are at least tempted to take a more pragmatic approach. I'm not sure that is particularly helpful. And I think it is not politically popular in Europe if Europe is seen as capitulating and letting Americans to write the regulation for the Europeans. I also think that if the Europeans are entering this dynamic whereby they would make concessions to say, okay, we drop this one investigation, well, guess what would be the next demand? That would come next day, and then you need to drop this investigation, then you need to roll back this law. I think that would be extremely harmful. And ultimately, you cannot buy stability with the US at this point. You cannot be certain that, okay, these trade concessions will never be revisited. The threats about withdrawal of security guarantees would never be renewed. So I think it's going to be a heavily and constantly managed relationship. And unlike in the past, digital regulation is now suddenly in the very heart of this one as well. But maybe I know that I've taken a lot of time, and we only have a few minutes, so I want to make sure we at least really go to questions from the audience. But Peter, Elsa, wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, yes, thank you indeed to this excellent panel. What a fantastic conversation to listen in on. And we will now turn to the Q&A. In the interest of time, we will take just a couple of questions from Amit that we've received. And thank you for those. So I will read them out loud for the sake of the YouTube recording, but if you prefer, they're in the Q&A box to read. The first question, are there emerging fourth models of digital regulation beyond the US, EU, China triad? And the second one, which we think it will be quite interesting to look at, is to what extent do global South countries exercise regulatory sovereignty in the face of digital empires?
So very good. I think the conversations that I've had since the book, the most often I get the question is India, also a digital empire. I think it's a wonderful question. And the book doesn't do quite enough justice to the interesting developments in India. I'm not sure I would call India a digital empire, but I do mention and since have spoken more about the digital public infrastructure that India is associated with, which I think is not significant just for India, but potentially an export for India for the rest of the world. And that can also shape the way we think about sort of the digital public infrastructure that is different to when the private companies in the US are providing these infrastructures for us. So I certainly have been happy when I've seen more discussion on how India fits in this question and remain open to this idea that new digital empires may emerge, but even the existing empires, their relative power will likely fluctuate. The global South, whether the global South is at the mercy of empires, I think there's now a global conversation on AI sovereignty and how concentrated the benefits will be. I think it's not limited to AI, but it's particularly stark in the AI era, whether the dependencies from these empires is something that is inevitable, or whether the global south can also assert agency and independence. I think in many ways, the global south is to some extent dependent on the empires in providing fundamental digital infrastructures. And I mentioned a few reasons why China is often an attractive partner, because that infrastructure is more affordable, how the US and the EU could compete better if they were more united. I think for Europe, there's an opportunity to also then provide an alternative model for the countries in the global south that would start from this assumption, not what the Europeans can extract from that collaboration, but whether Europeans can provide alternatives that better serve the genuine interests and values together with stronger local partnerships. But that also all assumes that there is also a technology stack that the Europeans can provide. And that makes Europe a credible partner, not just in helping to draft regulation, helping to discuss the values, but also then to help the dire needs for these countries to get access to the key technologies. So maybe they are richer questions, and I wish we had more time, but maybe I will leave it there, Emily, if you want to get anything, or if Elsa or Peter want to comment on that.
Yes, indeed. We've had quite a lot of questions come in the last minute. For those who have sent their questions and we've run out of time to answer them, I made a note of them, and so we'll do our best to answer them in the YouTube kind of description that will be with this video recording. So yeah, do check there. And well, for anyone who would like to rewatch parts of today's session or share with interested peers, do check our website and our YouTube in the coming days for the recording of today. And you can always head to our website to see what else we're up to as well. With that, we'll draw things, bring it to a close. A huge thank you to Anu Bradford, Elsa Hedling, and Peter Gottschalk. It's been exactly the conversation we hoped for, and I suspect the questions raised today will stay with many of us for some time. If you'd like to continue exploring these themes, do visit the EU Values Network website, and you'll find more of our work on European governance, digital regulation, and the values shaping our world there. And thank you very much for watching.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.